3 days before her wedding, Chloe received the kind of phone call that destroys a daughter's heart. Her own father told her he would not walk her down the aisle, not because he was sick, not because he couldn't come, but because her sister might feel overshadowed. For years, Chloe had been the quiet one, the reasonable one, the child everyone expected to sacrifice. But this time, she didn't beg, she didn't cry. She opened a secret folder called Evidence and prepared to let her family destroy themselves.
The pruning shears snapped shut with a cold metallic click. I stared at the severed orchid stem, its white petals already bruised. My sister Laura sent it to me last week. It was gorgeous, wildly expensive, and rootless, so of course it was dying. "You just need to be sensitive to the situation, Chloe," my father Ez's voice said. It crackled from the speakerphone on my potting table, sounding 1,000 miles away. "Laura's having a hard time with Marcus. And seeing you this happy, with everything falling into place, it's just bad timing. I can't walk you down the aisle if she's sitting there feeling like a failure." It was 3 days, just 72 hours, until my wedding, and my own father was backing out. Not because he was sick, not because his flight was cancelled. He was bailing on me because my wedding was an inconvenience for his favourite child. "Your father's right, honey?" My mother's voice joined his, faint and distant. I could picture her arranging her own perfect flowers in the kitchen. "Just have the officiant ask everyone to support you. It's what modern women do now. It's no big deal, right? People think your family will have your back when things get tough. They wrong. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you most are the ones who push you off the cliff." If you've ever had your big moment stolen so someone else could have the spotlight, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Tell me your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from. I'm your host, and this is Final Notice, a story you don't want to miss. I placed the dead orchid on the table. I didn't scream, I didn't fight. I didn't ask how they could destroy my wedding just to protect a grown woman's fragile feelings. The girl who would have cried about this 10 years ago was gone, replaced by someone cold and clear. My thoughts jumped back to a middle school auditorium. I was 13, standing next to my project on the alpine ecosystems of the Rocky Mountains. A first place ribbon was pinned right to the corner. Beside my project were 2 empty folding chairs. My parents had skipped the state science fair because Laura had a dance recital rehearsal that same afternoon. This wasn't a new story, just a bigger stage. "Okay," I said, my voice perfectly even. "I get it." A huge sigh of relief came in through the phone. "Oh, thank God. You've always been the reasonable one, Chloe. We'll just slip in the back and leave early. We have to help Laura with her big anniversary party that night anyway." "See you Saturday," I said, and I hung up the phone. I then opened my phone again. My fingers found a secure app, opening a private folder I'd been building for the last 6 months. The folder's title was simple: Evidence. I uploaded the recording of the phone call and watched the progress bar complete. Outside my workshop, the aspen wind howled against the glass. I was 29, the founder of an organic skincare line that my family called my little gardening hobby. I was no stranger to the cold. In fact, I preferred it. I opened my text and found Liam Thorne, the man I was about to marry. To my family, Liam was just a mountain guide with a beat-up old Jeep and a closet full of flannel. Nothing like Laura's high-powered husband. They had no clue who Liam really was, and they never bothered to look past the mud on his hiking boots. I typed out a quick message. "Dad's out. He's not walking me down the aisle. He said Laura would feel overshadowed." I put my phone down and went back to my work. I was expecting him to call, maybe send a long text telling me everything would be okay. 30 seconds later, my screen lit up with just one new message. Liam didn't send his sympathy. He didn't send outrage. The text just said, "Don't worry about a thing." I know exactly who to call. To understand why my father would ditch my wedding over the phone, you have to understand what really runs my family. And that currency has a name: Marcus. My brother-in-law was a venture capitalist, the kind who wore $1,000 in sneakers with his suits, drove an electric SUV that cost more than a house, and made sure everyone knew it. He was the one who funded my parents' lifestyle. He paid for their golf club membership. He covered the lease on my mother's brand new car. And for that, my parents, Richard and Vivian, gave him their absolute loyalty. Marcus owned their respect, so he made the rules. 2 weeks before that phone call, we were all at a fancy steakhouse in downtown Aspen. The lights were dim, the prices were insane, and you could feel the power imbalance in the air. Liam and I were tucked into the side of the booth, just drinking water. Marcus sat at the head of the table, making a show of sniffing his expensive wine. "So, Liam," he said, speaking loud enough for other tables to hear, "still playing in the mountains with tourists? When are you going to get a real job? A man your age should be building a portfolio, not a collection of trail maps." My father let out a weak little laugh, trying to get on the good side of the man paying for his dinner. My fists clenched under the table. I started to say something, but Liam put a warm, steady hand on my leg. He didn't look offended. He didn't even look annoyed. He just looked at Marcus like a biologist studying a strange but harmless bug. "I like the trails," Liam said, his voice calm and low. "They always get me exactly where I need to be." Marcus just rolled his eyes. "Well, I guess not everyone has the killer instinct. In my world, you have to build. Take my new tech campus on the west side. We're building a massive new innovation hub, cutting-edge labs, green offices, the works. It's going to completely transform this town." My mother leaned in, her eyes wide with fake admiration. "That's just wonderful, Marcus. You do so much for this community." "I try, Vivian, I try," he said, draping his arm over the back of Laura's chair. "The only snag is a land access issue. We've got the funding, we've got the permits, but the main service road has to cut through a neighbouring property. And the owner is some old-school relic who won't play ball." "A relic?" my father asked, eager to be part of the conversation. "Some old-timer sitting on a few 100 acres of prime land," Marcus grumbled, waving his fork. "He won't grant us access, won't even take a meeting. He doesn't get how the modern world works. He's a fossil holding up progress, all because he likes his quiet view. I told my lawyers to find a way to force him out." "You can't fight the future." Liam took a slow sip of water. "Some people just value a quiet view more than a loud profit," he said softly. Marcus sneered. "Spoken like a true mountain guide. Real money builds things, Liam." Laura, clearly tired of the focus on her husband, tapped her nails on her glass. She needed all eyes back on her, where they belonged. "Speaking of the future and big news," Laura announced, her voice suddenly high and cheerful. "Marcus and I have decided to throw a last-minute anniversary party. We want to celebrate us, and we have some investors coming to town we need to impress." My mother clapped her hands. "Oh, Laura, a party? How wonderful! When are you thinking of having it?" Laura looked right at me, a sharp, smug smile on her face. "Saturday, June 14th. I know it's sudden, but it's the only weekend the investors are here, so we just have to make it work." The entire table fell silent. June 14th was my wedding day. I had mailed the invitation 6 months ago. My parents didn't say a word. They didn't even look surprised. My father just stared down at his steak, while my mother immediately started planning. "Well," my mother said, her voice strained but agreeable, "I guess we'll just have a very busy day. We can make both events work, can't we, Richard?" "Absolutely," my father said, way too fast. "It's a huge weekend for the family." I just sat there frozen. This wasn't an accident. This was the whole point. Laura picked that date on purpose to make them choose, to see who held the leash. She wanted to prove, in front of all of us, that her party was more important than my wedding. It was a calculated move to isolate me, to show me that I would always come in second place. When dinner was finally over, we all stepped out onto the freezing Aspen Street. The mountain air felt like ice. We walked to the parking garage where Marcus' brand new electric Rivian was parked, looking like a spaceship. Next to it was Liam S. Muddy, 10-year-old Jeep. Marcus unlocked his car with a self-satisfied beep. "Drive safe, you two," he called out, his voice dripping with fake concern. "Hope that old thing can handle the cold." Liam walked right past the driver's side of the Rivian. He paused and ran one finger over the perfectly clean paint. He looked at the truck, and then he looked at Marcus. "Nice vehicle, Marcus," Liam said calmly. The executive fleet lease out of Denver, right? The premier package. They keep these corporate lease cars in top shape. Marcus froze. The smirk on his face evaporated, replaced by a flash of sheer panic. His hand paused on the car door. It's a business asset. Marcus shot back, his voice tight and defensive. Smart financial planning. Very smart, Leo agreed, giving him a calm nod. You have a good night. We got into our old Jeep. Leo turned the key and the engine rumbled to life instantly. Pulling out, I saw Marcus in the rearview mirror, just standing by his new car, watching us go. He was clearly rattled that some mountain guide just pinpointed the financial tightrope, holding his perfect life together. I rested my head on the window, the city lights streaking by. My thoughts went back to dinner, to Sophia's smug smile and how our parents just folded. My sister is like a perfect bouquet. She needs constant attention, fancy parties, and fresh praise just to seem vibrant. She needs expensive cars and a crowd of admirers just to feel like she's real. Without all that, she'd wilt in a week. I've spent my career designing gardens. I know that real strength grows underground, in the quiet, where no one can see it. I was building roots, the kind of deep, solid roots that can survive a brutal Colorado winter. They thought I'd fade away without their approval. They had no clue what was coming for them. Just 2 days before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, the air in my design studio smelled of charcoal and fresh-cut pine. I was at my drafting table, meticulously arranging pressed alpine flowers for the table settings into delicate glass frames. This was my safe space. In here, I controlled the variables. Lines could be erased, plans redrawn, beauty cultivated. But outside these walls, everything was spiraling out of control. My phone buzzed on the drafting table. The screen showed the name Jessica Moore. Jessica was the manager for the Aspen Mountain Lodge, where Leo and I were getting married in 2 days. She was a friend who sold my botanical prints in the lodge's gift shop. I brushed the charcoal from my hands and answered. "Clara, you need to just listen to me right now," Jessica said. Her voice was sharp and tense, completely different from her usual friendly professional tone. It was all business. "Your brother-in-law, Marcus, is in my office right now." He just put a big envelope stuffed with cash on my desk and asked me to name a price to cancel your wedding and book the entire lodge for this Saturday night. My hand froze in mid-air. The nerve of it felt like a punch to the gut. He wasn't just trying to upstage our wedding with some last-minute party. He was literally trying to buy the venue out from under me. "What did you say?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I told him our contracts don't have buyout clauses," Jessica said. "He just laughed and told me everyone has a price. He offered $10,000 in cash to cancel your booking and give the space to his people. I told him to get out or I'd call security. Clara, he's in the lobby on his phone right now. You have to deal with this." "Don't sign a thing, Jessica. I'm on my way." I hung up and tore off my work apron. My gloves slapped down on the table. Marcus thought his money meant he could ignore common decency. He thought he could just write a check and make me disappear. I grabbed my keys and stormed out of the studio. The Colorado sun was bright and harsh. As I got to my car, a polished black Escalade rolled up my driveway. The SUV parked perfectly, its engine a low, expensive hum. The driver's door opened and Ava Sterling stepped out. Ava was Leo's older sister, a high-powered corporate lawyer from New York who specialized in hostile takeovers. She wore a sharp, tailored suit that seemed to command respect, with a silk blouse and a look in her eyes that saw everything. Ava built her career by taking apart arrogant men in conference rooms before they'd had their first espresso. "Get in," Ava said. Her voice was quiet but left no room for argument. I stopped dead in my tracks. "How did you know?" "Leo called me," Ava said, opening the passenger door of the Escalade for me. "He deals with the mountains. I deal with the problems, and your brother-in-law is a problem. Get in the car, Clara. We're getting lunch. You look like you need to eat, and we need to set some boundaries." I got into the plush leather seat. The car smelled like expensive perfume and clean leather. Ava pulled back onto the road, heading for downtown Aspen. She drove with the same focus she probably used to tear apart contracts. We got to an expense bistro on the main strip, the kind with rustic wood beams, soft lighting, and staff who remember exactly how you take your coffee. Ava asked for a corner table with a view of the entrance. She ordered a simple salad and an espresso. I ordered a panini I knew I wouldn't be able to eat. "Your family sees your boundaries as a dare," Ava said, getting right to the point before our drinks even arrived. "This isn't just them being thoughtless. It's a planned attack. Your independence threatens their whole system. Marcus uses his wealth to control your parents. You don't need his money, so he has no power over you, and he can't stand it." I drew a line through the sweat on my water glass. "I know. I just didn't think he'd stoop this low. Buying out my venue 2 days before my wedding. It's insane." "It's desperation," Ava corrected. "People with real power don't need to wave envelopes of cash around. He's doing it because his whole charade is falling apart." Before I could even answer, the bell on the restaurant door jingled. I glanced up and my stomach dropped. Sophia walked in with our mother, Eleanor, trailing right behind her. They were both carrying shopping bags from a high-end designer shop nearby. Sophia was wearing an expensive coat, her hair perfectly styled. She surveyed the room and her eyes landed right on our table. A slow, smug grin appeared on her face as she glided over, dragging our mother with her like she was some kind of handbag. "Clara, fancy seeing you here," Sophia chirped. Her gaze flickered to Ava, instantly sizing up the expensive suit and the confident posture. "We were just getting some last-minute things for our party. The guest list just keeps getting bigger. Marcus's business partners expect a certain standard. You know," she glanced at my full water glass with fake concern. "It's too bad your little get-together doesn't have the budget for real floral arrangements. But I guess local wildflowers are cute, in a quaint sort of way." My mother just gave a strained smile, avoiding my gaze. Before I could say anything, Ava raised one perfectly manicured hand, placing it softly on the table. That small gesture silenced the table. "You must be Sophia," Ava said. Her voice was like velvet, smooth and dangerously calm. "Leo's told me about you." Sophia preened, fiddling with her designer purse. "Oh, well, I hope he only said nice things." Ava gave her a smile that was all ice. "He mentioned your husband works in high-end property development." "It's a fascinating field. I'm in corporate finance in New York. We see a lot of developers like Marcus." Sophia's confident expression wavered for a second. "Like Marcus?" "Yes," Ava went on, her tone light, like she was talking about the menu. "Men who are over-leveraged, who use secondary loans to patch the holes in their primary financing. It's a very risky game. You miss one payment, you break one little rule in the contract, and the lenders call in the entire debt. The leased cars get repossessed. The membership at the club gets cancelled. The whole thing collapses." Sophia's smile was gone. The colour drained from her face, leaving her looking pale under all that makeup. She blinked fast, her eyes jumping between Ava and me. "I have no idea what you're talking about. Marcus is very successful. He's closing a huge deal this weekend." "I'm sure he is," Ava said, calmly taking a sip of her espresso. "I'm just an attorney. I spend my time reading the financial disclosures, not the social announcements. Enjoy your party decor." "Sophia, I do hope it lasts." Sophia opened her mouth to argue, but nothing came out. She shot a look at our mother, grabbed her by the arm, and all but ran out of the restaurant. The bell on the door chimed again as they fled. I just stared at the empty doorway, my heart pounding. I had never seen anyone tear down my sister's arrogance so fast, and without even raising her voice. "That," Ava said, placing her cup down gently, "is how you deal with a bully. You never yell. You don't fight about the small stuff. You just calmly show them how close they are to the edge." I looked at Ava with a mix of total admiration and deep sadness. My own family was trying to ruin the happiest day of my life. And this woman, who I barely knew, was the one defending me. "You have to build a fortress, Penny," Maya said, her usual corporate tone gone, "because they will take and take until nothing's left." I stared at my hands, dirt still under my nails from the greenhouse. I know I need to cut them off. I know my family is toxic, but there's this tiny pathetic part of me that still wants my dad to walk me down the aisle. I just want him to choose me for once. Maya grabbed my hand across the table. Her grip was firm, warm, a silent promise. We protect our own, Penny. Your father has a choice, and if he makes the wrong one, I swear the entire Thorne family will be your shield. You won't walk to that altar by yourself. We ate the rest of our lunch in silence. Maya drove me home, her tires crunching on my gravel driveway. I thanked her, feeling a little stronger, like I'd put on armour. But when I got out of her Navigator and looked at my greenhouse, I stopped dead. A beat-up, vintage pickup was parked right by the loading bay. An older man in a faded Stetson and canvas jacket was standing there, looking at a tray of my sage seedlings. He could have been any ranch hand, the type that just blends right into the Montana scenery, but I knew exactly who he was. And as if on cue, my phone lit up with a text from my father. This day was not over. I walked toward the idling pickup near my greenhouse's loading bay. The man was asked Harrison Caldwell. To anyone else, he'd just looked like another old Montana rancher faded Stetson, canvas jacket with frayed cuffs, and boots caked in real mud. But he was so much more than that. My parents saw him once at a diner and wrote him off as just some local yokel. They had no idea Harrison Caldwell owned the diner, the land it was on, the bank that held its mortgage, and about half the commercial real estate in the whole county. He was a billionaire who'd rather talk to horses than sit in a boardroom. We met 2 years ago. Vets wanted to put down his best quarter horse because of a bad hoof infection. I stayed up for 3 straight nights, creating a special botanical salve from alpine extracts and powerful root compounds. It worked. The horse was walking in a week. My family calls my business my little weed-picking hobby. But that hobby bought me the silent, unbreakable loyalty of the most powerful man in Montana. "You look like you've been wrestling a bobcat, Penny," Harrison said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Just wedding stuff, Harry, you know. The joy of family." He wasn't buying it for a second. His eyes scanned my face, cutting right through the fake smile. "I came for the new batch of salve," he said, nodding to a crate of jars. "But I've got time for coffee if you need an ear. You look pale." I poured him a cup from the thermos on my workbench. We just stood there in the warm, earthy greenhouse air. For months, I'd bottled up all the pain, putting on a brave face. But everything that happened today, plus the kindness from a man who was more family than my actual family, it was too much. The walls came down. I told him absolutely everything. I told him how my dad wasn't walking me down the aisle anymore. I told him about the anniversary party they planned to overshadow my own wedding. I explained how my father was choosing my brother-in-law over me. Harrison just listened. No cheap reassurances. He just sipped his coffee, his jaw clenching under that weathered skin. "This brother-in-law, what's his name?" Harrison's voice had a new edge to it, sharp and cold. "Preston," I said, wiping a tear. "Preston Hayes. He's a property developer. My parents depend on his money, so he calls all the shots." Harrison didn't say anything. He just lowered his cup to the counter, very slowly. A flicker of cold recognition lit up his eyes. He tilted his head, connecting the dots. "Preston Hayes," Harrison repeated. "The one building, that concrete monstrosity on the west side, needs an easement to start construction." I just stared, shocked. He knew the details. Yes, he was just complaining about some difficult landowner blocking his access. He called the guy a dinosaur. A slow, dangerous smile spread across Harrison's face. It was the kind of smile that comes right before a storm. He pulled a thick roll of cash from his pocket and put it on the counter for the salve. "Keep the change," he said, adjusting his Stetson. His eyes met mine, full of fierce protection. A father is supposed to clear the way for his daughter. If he won't, someone else will. He tipped his hat, grabbed the crate of salves, and headed to his truck. I watched him drive off, the gravel crunching, and I suddenly understood. Preston's dinosaur problem was about to cause an extinction. I barely had a moment to process what just happened when my phone buzzed on the bench. It was a new text from my father. I unlocked it, maybe hoping for an apology or something. Instead, I read a message that showed me just how conditional his love really was. He said there was a situation. Preston's investors needed prime seats at our reception. He suggested I uninvite the Thorne family, my future in-laws, to make space. If I didn't, he'd pull his $500 contribution to the flowers. We must prioritize, it said. I had to read it 3 times. My father wanted me to kick out my future in-laws, people who had only ever been kind to me, for some developers' business partners. And he was using a pathetic $500 check for flowers as blackmail. He actually thought I was that desperate. He figured the threat of losing money would make me fold, just like it always worked on my mother. He really believed I valued his measly contribution over my own self-respect. I didn't cry. I didn't write some long, dramatic text about how hurt I was. What's the point in arguing with a man who only understands power? So I just put my fingers on the screen and typed one single word, no, and I hit send. I didn't even wait for him to reply. I walked to my desk in the greenhouse, opened a drawer, and took out my checkbook. With a dark ink pen, I wrote out the name Hector Ramirez. In the little box, I wrote 500, and on the memo line I wrote floral contribution refund. I ripped the check out, folded it, and slid it into a clean white envelope. I wrote my father's address, put a stamp on it, and left it on my desk for the morning mail. My father thought $500 gave him control over my wedding guests. He thought it bought him the right to insult the people I love. By returning his money, I was cancelling his access to my life. I didn't need his pathetic, conditional handouts for my wedding, and I sure didn't need his permission to defend the people I love. That envelope on my desk was proof of a bridge I had just burned myself, and it felt amazing. I looked around my greenhouse, smelling the damp earth. I had finally drawn a line in the sand. I said no, but I knew my family. Fighting back always meant they'd hit back harder and faster. My mom was supposed to come with me to my final dress fitting tomorrow. It was the one mother-daughter thing we'd planned. I stared at that check on the desk, a cold dread twisting in my gut. My father would get my message tomorrow. He'd know I refused to give in to Preston, and I knew, with a horrible certainty, that my mom showing up at the bridal shop would be the next victim in their war on me. The morning of the fitting was beautiful and crisp, the kind of Montana morning I usually love. But not today. Today it just felt like a spotlight. I was standing in my room, staring at my phone. A text from my mother had come in 15 minutes ago. "So sorry, sweetie," it read, "but your sister Izzy is having a total meltdown." Apparently, the salon double-booked her nail appointment for the gala, and Mom needed to go play peacemaker. "You know how she gets, so she couldn't make the fitting. You look beautiful in everything," she wrote. "Send pics." I stared at the screen until the words went blurry. A nail appointment. My mother was bailing on our one and only bridal moment because my 30-year-old sister threw a fit over a manicure for a party that was designed to hurt me. I didn't even answer. I just locked my phone, grabbed my keys, and drove to the bridal shop in downtown Bozeman by myself. The boutique was beautiful, all silk and soft lights. The owner, Clara, was this sweet older woman who led me to the fitting room with a kind smile, and her kindness just made the hole in my chest feel bigger. I slipped into the ivory crepe dress, its botanical lace crawling up the bodice. It was perfect. Clara helped me up onto the pedestal before the massive mirrors. "Where is Vivian today?" she asked softly, arranging the train. She was so excited to see the final changes. She had a scheduling conflict, I managed, my voice steady. In the mirror I saw a bride. But standing all alone in that quiet shop, the armor I'd worn for the last 2 days finally cracked. I realized I was grieving people who hadn't even died. I was mourning the parents I should have had, the ones I deserved. They always chose my Sister S' latest drama over my biggest moments. A single, hot tear escaped and ran down my cheek. I squeezed my eyes shut, so angry at myself for falling apart. Just then, a little chime rang as the boutique door opened. I heard the confident click-clack of heels coming my way. "You look magnificent, Penelope," a voice said. I opened my eyes. It was Maya Thorne. She stood in the doorway, a camel-coloured cashmere coat over her usual tailored suit, holding 2 coffees from a local shop. "Maya," I whispered, quickly wiping the tear away. "What are you doing here?" "Elias mentioned your mother had a last-minute emergency," Maya said. Her tone was neutral, but her eyes saw everything. "I was nearby reviewing contracts and thought you might want a second opinion on the hem." She came over, handed me a coffee, and then stepped back to look at the dress. She didn't offer pity or ask where my mother was. She just stepped into that empty space with her powerful presence. "The lace is exquisite," Maya said with a nod. "It suits you. Grounded, elegant, strong. Clara, could we take the waist in just a tiny bit? It has to be absolutely perfect." For the next hour, Maya was the mother I desperately needed. She helped with veil lengths, talked about shoes, and gave real thoughtful compliments. When Clara brought the final bill for the rush job, I went for my purse, but Maya was quicker. She'd already handed Clara a black corporate card before my wallet was even out. "Maya, no," I protested, my face getting hot. "I can pay. You've already done so much." Maya turned to me, her look softening but still fiercely maternal. "Put your wallet away, Penny. It's handled. But I can't ask you to do that." I insisted. "You didn't ask," Maya said smoothly as she signed the slip. I offered. "You're marrying my brother in 2 days. That makes you family." "And the Thorns? We protect our own. Your mother made her choice, and I've made mine. Now, let's go get lunch before the rehearsal." The rehearsal dinner was that evening at a beautiful rustic timber lodge at the foot of the Bridger Mountains. The vibe was just what Elias and I wanted, warm, intimate, full of laughter. The entire Thorn clan was there. Aunts, uncles, and cousins from Chicago and Seattle packed the room. They were successful but down-to-earth, teachers, architects, and business owners, all mixing easily and welcoming me like I was already one of them. The 4 empty chairs near the head table were impossible to miss. My parents, my sister, and Preston still hadn't shown up. For the first hour, I greeted Elias's family, thanking them for coming, while trying to ignore the huge empty space on my side of the room. I kept watching the big wooden doors, hoping my dad would just walk in and take his seat. When the main course arrived, those doors were still shut. I excused myself to the restroom for a quiet moment. I locked myself in a stall and took out my phone just to check the time. But out of habit, I opened Instagram. The very first thing I saw was a story from Isabella, posted a half hour ago. It was a photo from a private room at the fanciest steakhouse in Bozeman. The table was loaded with expensive steaks, huge seafood towers, and fancy champagne. Around that table sat Preston's rich investors. Right across from Isabella, raising their glasses for a toast, were my own parents, Hector and Vivian Ramirez. So they weren't running late. They didn't have a flat tire. They chose a dinner to impress Preston's business partners over their own daughter's rehearsal dinner. I stared at the phone, the picture burning into my mind, and the caption Isabella wrote at the bottom, that was the final twist of the knife. "Family is whoever supports your dreams. Cheers to building empires." A cold, hard feeling washed over me. The very last thread of hope I had for my family just snapped. I took a screenshot and moved it straight into my receipts folder. The evidence was piling up, a whole documented history of their betrayal. I washed my hands, fixed my lipstick, and walked back to the dining room. I didn't look defeated. I looked determined. Elias was waiting by the stone fireplace. He noticed the change in me right away. He didn't ask if I was okay. He just reached out and pulled me into a long, quiet hug. "They're not coming," I whispered into his chest. "They're at a dinner with Preston's investors." Izzy posted it. Elias pulled back a little, his dark eyes going hard. "Show me." I gave him my phone with the screenshot still on it. He studied the picture, the fancy food, my parents smiling, and that smug caption. A muscle in his jaw twitched. The calm, easygoing nature guide was gone. In his place was a man who waged corporate war with deadly skill. He handed my phone back, pulled his own from his pocket, and said softly, "Excuse me for a moment." I watched him walk down the quiet hall toward the lodge offices. He put the phone to his ear. I followed, staying hidden, because I had to know what he was doing. Elias's voice was low, but it held total authority. "David, it's Thorn. I need the Hayes portfolio, the commercial development in Bozeman. Yes, that one. He paused for a moment while the other person replied. I don't care about the margins, Elias said, his voice turning to ice. He's been pushing his luck on liquidity for 3 months. We've been giving him a pass because of Penelope. That pass expires tonight. Another pause. Call the note, Elias ordered. Execute the breach of contract clause. Now, start foreclosure on the commercial property first thing Monday. And David, make sure the main lender knows exactly how over-leveraged he is. Let us see how long his investors stay when the whole thing falls apart. Elias hung up and pocketed his phone. He turned and saw me standing there in the shadows. He didn't look guilty at all. He looked like a man who had just taken out a threat to his wife. He walked over, put his arm around my waist, and guided me back to the warm dining room where his family was. We redone, giving him a pass? Elias said quietly, leaning down to kiss my temple. The illusion is over on Monday. Now let S go celebrate with the family that S actually here. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of the bridal suite at the Bozeman Botanical Gardens. The room was cool and smelled of eucalyptus, jasmine, and the faint, earthy scent of the damp ground outside. The whole room was designed to be calm. I sat in a velvet chair as a makeup artist put on the final touches. In the mirror, I saw a woman who looked rested, calm, and completely ready. Maya stood by the window, staring at a document on her tablet with the intensity of a hawk. Her emerald green dress was a beautiful contrast to the rustic wood beams above. The atmosphere was so peaceful, without the usual chaos that followed my family everywhere. My phone buzzed on the marble counter. The screen lit up with a new text from my mother, Vivian. I picked it up. The text said, "Morning, sweetie. Breakfast with Preston S. Associates ran late. We heading over. We just grab seats in the back by the exit so we can sneak out after you say your vows. Izzy needs help with flowers for her gala tonight. The caterers are a mess. Don't want to hold you up. Can't wait to see you." I read the message 2 times. A year ago, those words would have broken me. I would have texted back, begging them to stay for the party, offering to change everything, doing whatever it took just to make them care. But today, the words were just hollow. They had no power to hurt me anymore. It was the final nail in the coffin for my childhood fantasies. My own mother was treating my wedding like an annoying errand, just something to check off her list before her real day started. Model. Sitting in the back row wasn't just a strategic choice for them, it was a clear signal of their emotional distance. I put my phone down on the vanity. I didn't shed a single tear. I didn't even type a reply. Instead, I opened my secure banking app. I scrolled past my business accounts, ignoring the large balances from my botanical design work, and tapped into my personal checking account. I navigated to the pending transactions, and there it was, glowing on the screen. Check number 492 for $500, payable to Hector Ramirez. He had threatened to cancel this pathetic little contribution if I refused to uninvite my future in-laws to make space for Preston's investors. I selected the stop payment option. The system asked me for a reason. I typed 4 simple words. Services no longer required. I hit confirm. The screen flashed green, confirming the cancellation. The financial leash was snapped. It was a tiny amount of money, but the symbolic weight of that act was massive. I was no longer interested in their transactional idea of affection. I locked my phone and slid it into my wedding clutch. From the second-story window of the bridal suite, I had a perfect, clear view of the main gravel parking lot. The crunch of tires caught my ear. Preston's silver Porsche Macan pulled into a reserved spot by the entrance, sending up a small cloud of dry Montana dust. My father got out, adjusting his tie and scowling at the rustic sign for the venue. My mother emerged a moment later, holding her dress away from the ground with a look of pure disdain. Isabella stepped out last. She was wearing a pale champagne, floor-length gown covered in beads that sparkled in the sun. It was suspiciously close to bridal white, a classic, pathetic attempt to steal the spotlight. Preston locked the car, and the loud double chirp echoed across the quiet lot. As my family began walking toward the Iron Garden gates, a convoy of sleek black Suburbans rolled into the lot, moving in perfect unison. These vehicles were spotless, with government plates and an unmistakable air of quiet authority. Men and women in perfectly tailored suits started getting out of the SUVs. I recognized some of them from the news and business magazines. One was a state senator known for his aggressive land conservation policies. Another was the CEO of a huge tech company based in Seattle. Several powerful members of the Chicago legal world, friends of Maya, also emerged. My father stopped dead in his tracks, staring at the procession. He puffed out his chest, then turned to my mother with a smug, self-satisfied grin spreading across his face. "Look at that, Vivian," Hector said, his voice carrying up on the morning air. Preston's investors. He probably invited them to show off his powerful local connections. He's such a great provider for Izzy, bringing this kind of capital to a simple little garden party. My mother nodded eagerly, linking her arm in Hector's. They strutted through the gates, radiating a completely unearned sense of pride. They were totally convinced these politicians and executives were here to fund a failing real estate developer. They had no clue that these powerful people were here to honor Elias, the man they'd written off as just some poor wilderness guide. The heavy oak door to my bridal suite swung open. Sarah, the event director, walked in, holding her clipboard. "It's time, Penelope," she said softly, giving me a warm, encouraging smile. Maya came over and gently smoothed the lace on my wedding dress train. She squeezed my shoulder, a quiet moment of support, before she headed downstairs to take her seat in the front row. I gathered the fabric of my skirt, walked out of the suite, and started down the sweeping wooden staircase. The string quartet in the garden began a soft melody that drifted over the perfect hedges. I finally reached the entrance to the main pavilion. The huge wooden doors were still closed, hiding me from the 150 guests waiting inside. I just stood there, clutching my bouquet of white peonies and fresh eucalyptus. I was completely alone. My father wasn't standing there beside me. There was no reassuring arm to hold, no proud parent whispering last-minute words of encouragement. There was just the quiet sound of my silk dress against the stone floor. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and let the cool mountain air fill my lungs. I readied myself to push open those doors and face the empty space my own family had deliberately left beside me. I braced myself for the pitying stares of guests watching a bride walk down the aisle by herself. Then a shadow fell on the stone floor right next to me. Someone had quietly stepped up to my right side, blocking the bright morning sun. I turned my head and the breath caught in my throat. The string quartet transitioned flawlessly into a delicate, powerful classical arrangement. The music swelled, flowing over the hedges and filling the crisp mountain air. From where I stood, just behind the heavy oak doors, the music was both beautiful and terrifying. That was the signal. I gripped my bouquet tighter, the stems feeling cool and damp in my hands. My heart was hammering against my ribs. For the last 48 hours, I had built a fortress around my heart, telling myself I didn't need my family's approval. But right there, moments from the altar, the weight of being so alone nearly crushed me. I was ready to walk by myself, ready to face 150 pitying stares as I took that long walk with no father on my arm. But then, a shadow stretched out on the stone beside me. A hint of rich cologne and old leather cut through the gardenia scent. I turned, and my breath caught in my throat. Liam Vance was standing beside me. He wasn't in his usual faded jeans or work boots. The tech billionaire was wearing a custom-made navy blue Brioni suit that fit him perfectly, like armor. He looked every bit the giant of industry he was, projecting a quiet, unbreakable power that demanded respect from everyone. He was 70 years old, but he stood as straight as a Montana pine tree. "Harry," I whispered, my voice shaking, "what are you doing here?" He turned to me, his eyes crinkling at the corners with real warmth. "I told you, Penelope, a father's job is to clear the path. If yours won't do it, I would consider it a deep honor to step in." He then extended his arm to me. The gesture was simple, but its weight grounded me immediately. The panic disappeared, replaced by a sudden wave of overwhelming gratitude. I looped my arm through his, feeling the solid, steady strength of the man who had become my mentor when my own family failed me. "Ready to show them what real strength looks like?" Harrison asked, his voice a low, steady rumble. I nodded, a real smile finally breaking across my face. "I'm ready." The heavy wooden doors swung open. The afternoon sun poured into the pavilion, blinding me for a second before the entire scene came into view. The garden was absolutely stunning. Rows of white chairs sat on the bright green grass, filled with guests murmuring with excitement. At the end of the aisle, under an arch of eucalyptus and white roses, stood Elias. He looked so handsome in a tailored black suit. His dark eyes were locked on me, holding a promise of a lifetime of love and safety. We took our first step. I felt the shift in the air immediately. The polite, quiet silence of the crowd was shattered. It wasn't a murmur, it was a single, audible gasp that shot through the rows of guests like a shockwave. My eyes found the back row. My father, Hector, was sitting there with his arms crossed, his posture stiff and angry. He had deliberately sat near the exit, with a smug look on his face, ready to watch his youngest daughter's humiliating solo walk down the aisle. He wanted me to feel the burn of his absence, but instead, Hector watched me appear on the arm of Harrison Caldwell. I saw the precise moment my father realized who was walking me. The smug look vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unfiltered terror. All the colour drained from his face, leaving him looking sick and grey. He actually shrank back in his chair, suddenly trying to make himself invisible. The man he'd called a country, nobody was the most powerful man in the entire state, and that man was proudly walking the daughter Hector had just thrown away. Next to my father, my mother Vivian clapped her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with total shock. She looked from me to Harrison and then over to Isabella, who was sitting rigid in her champagne dress, her mouth hanging open in disbelief. But the best reaction of all belonged to Preston. Preston, the flashy developer who tried to steal my venue. Preston, who made fun of my fiancé and flaunted his borrowed wealth. Preston, whose entire real estate empire now depended on a stubborn old dinosaur granting him a critical easement. Preston's jaw literally hit the floor. He gripped his seat so hard his knuckles turned white. His eyes darted from Harrison's face back to mine as the awful realization crashed down on him. The dinosaur he had insulted, the landowner his lawyers were trying to squeeze, was walking his future sister-in-law down the aisle. The entire power dynamic of my family just completely disintegrated in about 30 seconds. Their financial power, their whole carefully built illusion of being better, was destroyed by the simple fact of who was on my arm. Harrison leaned down as we walked, his voice low enough for only me to hear. "Your brother-in-law looks like he just swallowed a wasp," Harrison whispered. "I'd guess he's reconsidering his entire strategy on that commercial access road right about now." A bright, genuine laugh bubbled up right from my chest. It wasn't some polite, held-back bridal chuckle. It was a real, shining laugh that actually reached my eyes. The photographer's flash went off, capturing the moment perfectly. A bride, glowing with pure happiness, walking confidently beside a titan. We reached the end of the aisle. The music swelled to a final triumphant note and then faded into a respectful silence. Harrison turned and faced Elias. The two men just looked at each other. There was no posturing, no sizing one another up. There was just the quiet, mutual respect of two men who understood the value of the woman standing right between them. Harrison extended his hand. Elias took it, their grip firm and sure. "Take care of her, Elias," Harrison said, his voice carrying easily to the front rows. "She's one of a kind. I've got her, sir," Elias replied smoothly, his eyes never leaving mine. "Always." Harrison stepped back, taking a seat in the very first row, in the chair specifically saved for the father of the bride. He sat tall, a silent, powerful guardian watching over the ceremony. I turned to face Elias, slipping my hands into his. The warmth of his palms grounded me completely. The minister began to speak, words about commitment and partnership, but the entire world just faded into the background. I didn't look back at that final row. I didn't need to see my parents to know they were sitting there, paralyzed by the sheer weight of their mistake. They had chosen to build their lives in a house of cards, and they were now watching the wind begin to blow. We exchanged our vows under the open Montana sky. The words felt heavier, more profound, because of the battles we had fought to arrive at this moment. When Alia slipped the gold band onto my finger, the metal felt cool and permanent. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. "You may kiss the bride." Elias leaned in, his lips meeting mine in a kiss that was gentle, grounding, and deeply reassuring. The crowd erupted into applause. We turned to face our guests, our fingers intertwined. We walked back up the aisle together, the new Mr. and Mrs. Thorne. As we passed the back row, I kept my gaze fixed straight ahead, looking out toward the beautiful gardens. I didn't spare a single look for Hector, Vivian, Isabella, or Preston. They were no longer the main characters of my story. They were merely spectators sitting near the exit, watching a life they were no longer invited to share. The ceremony was flawless, but as we moved into the cocktail hour and the evening reception started, the real reckoning was just getting started. My family had arrived expecting to just slip out unnoticed. They were about to discover that leaving was no longer an option, and the consequences for their arrogance were waiting for them at the bar. The reception was held under a sweeping canvas tent, pitched on the great lawn, lit by hundreds of hanging lanterns. Round tables in ivory linen surrounded a polished oak dance floor. The seating chart was no accident. It was a carefully designed map of my new reality. My parents, Isabella and Preston, found their place cards at table 19. It was tucked into the farthest corner of the tent, located uncomfortably close to the kitchen service doors. Every time a waiter came out with a tray of roasted prime rib, the heavy swinging door would brush the back of Hector's chair. For 29 years, my family had placed me at the very edge of their lives. Now, they were feeling the exact dimensions of that same space. I sat at the head table with Elias, surrounded by the Thorne family, local dignitaries, and Harrison Caldwell. From my seat, I watched the Ramirez family try to maintain their dignity. My mother picked at her salad, her eyes darting nervously around the opulent room. Isabella sat rigidly, refusing to touch her champagne-coloured gown blending into the shadowy corner. But Preston couldn't sit still. His real estate development was gushing cash, his investors were losing their faith, and the man who held the key to his survival was sitting less than 50 feet away. Preston saw Harrison Caldwell stand up and walk toward the mahogany bar. To a drowning man, a billionaire ordering a scotch looks an awful lot like a life raft. Preston smoothed his tie, ditched his wife, and navigated through the maze of tables. He approached the bar with a wide, practiced smile, faking the confidence of a man used to buying his way into closed circles. He ordered a bourbon, stepping smoothly into Harrison's line of sight. "Mr. Caldwell," Preston began, extending his hand. "Preston, Hayes, I'm Isabella's husband, Penelope's brother-in-law. I've been wanting to speak with you about the commercial parcel on the west side. We have a mutually beneficial opportunity regarding the easement." Harrison did not take the offered hand. He looked at Preston the way you might look at a smudge on a perfectly clean windshield. Before Harrison could speak, a delicate glass clinked against the polished mahogany bar. Maya Thorne stepped seamlessly between the two men. She wore her emerald dress like a suit of armor, her posture immaculate. "Mr. Hayes isn't conducting business tonight, Harrison," Maya said smoothly, offering the older man a warm nod. "He's far too preoccupied with his existing liabilities." Preston frowned, dropping his hand. "Excuse me, this is a private conversation." Maya turned to face him. Her expression was calm, analytical, and absolutely lethal. "We met briefly at the bistro, Preston. I am Maya Thorne. What I didn't mention during our last encounter is my formal title. I am the lead counsel for Thorne Enterprises." Preston blinked, the name failing to register for a split second. Then the colour drained from his cheeks. Thorne Enterprises was the mezzanine lender holding the distressed debt portfolio for his entire Bozeman development. They owned the paper on his failing condos. "Yes," Maya continued, her voice low enough that only the three of them could hear. "We hold your notes, Preston. All of them. And as of yesterday evening, you breached your liquidity covenants." Preston swallowed hard, his breath catching in his throat. "Your firm, you work for the holding company?" "I don't just work for them," Maya corrected gently. "It is a family firm. My brother serves as the chief executive officer." Preston's eyes widened in horror. His gaze darted frantically across the tent, landing on the head table where Elias sat, laughing easily with my college friends. The man Preston had mocked, the man he called a dirt-poor wilderness guide, was the CEO who controlled his financial existence. Elias was not guiding tourists. He was managing the trust that owned the mountain they hiked on. "The foreclosure proceedings initiate Monday morning," Maya informed him. "I suggest you enjoy the open bar while you still can." Preston stumbled back, bumping into a passing waiter. A tray of water glasses rattled dangerously. Maya picked up a sparkling water and returned to her seat, leaving him hyperventilating near the ice bins. A sharp ringing sound echoed through the tent as a spoon tapped against crystal. The chatter died down. Harrison stood at the head table, a microphone in his hand. The room fell silent, giving the floor to the Titan. "Weddings are about building futures," Harrison began, his voice projecting easily across the lawn. "Most people look at Penelope and see a beautiful bride. I look at her and see the sharpest scientific mind in this state." He paused, letting the words settle. He didn't sound like a savior bestowing a gift. He sounded like a business partner stating a fact. "For the past 6 months, Penelope and I have operated under a strict non-disclosure agreement," Harrison continued. "Tonight I am formally lifting it. My company, Caldwell Hospitality, spent 2 years searching for a proprietary botanical formulation for our global luxury spas. We tested products from Paris to Tokyo. The only formula that met our stringent standards was created in a small greenhouse right here in Bozeman. I looked at my parents' table. Hector was leaning forward, his brow furrowed in confusion. 6 months ago," Harrison said, his tone ringing with immense pride, "Penelope signed a $5 million exclusive supply contract with my board of directors. She secured it entirely on her own merit. She is not just a formulator. She is a self-made industry leader. Raise your glasses to Mrs. Thorne." The tent erupted. 150 guests stood up, cheering and applauding. The sound was deafening, a roaring wave of validation that washed away decades of being told I was small. Through the standing ovation, I locked eyes with my father. Hector Ramirez remained seated. The reality of the situation crashed down upon him, visible in the sagging lines of his face. The daughter he had dismissed as a weed picker, the daughter he refused to walk down the aisle, was a multi-millionaire who held the respect of the most influential people in his world. He had bet his entire legacy on a shiny leased car, throwing away a diamond just to hold on to a piece of broken glass. Isabella could not endure it. The applause felt like physical strikes to her ego. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the wooden dance floor. She grabbed her designer clutch and marched toward the exit. She reached the bar, grabbed Preston by the sleeve of his jacket, and dragged her hyperventilating husband out into the cold, dark Montana night. Monday morning, I was packing for our flight to Belize. The air in our new house was fresh, filled with the smell of coffee and coming rain. Liam was at the island, quietly checking emails before we left. We were enjoying the calm of our new life, clueless that a Category 5 hurricane was hitting my family across town. I'd pieced together the whole disaster later from public records and town gossip. At 8 a.m., Mark arrived at his sterile office, his head pounded from a weekend of total humiliation. He collapsed at his desk, desperate to come up with some kind of recovery plan. A thick ivory envelope sat right on his keyboard. The return address had the logo for Summit Ventures. Mark ripped it open, expecting a fight over profit shares. Instead, he found a single sheet of paper. It was a final, unconditional rejection of his zoning bid. The legal wording was merciless. The board cited a complete lack of integrity and poor character for cutting all ties, now and forever. His entire development project died right there on his desk. Before the paper even settled, his inbox pinged with an urgent alert. It was a certified notice from Apex Holdings' legal team. Notice of default. The bridge loans holding up his company were being called in. All of them. He had 30 days to find millions he didn't have. His glass office felt like a fishbowl. Across town, my sister Sophie was in her own bubble, fighting a battle she'd already lost in the city's top party planner's office. She was determined to repair her ego by throwing a gala that would make everyone forget my wedding. She approved imported floral arrangements and a champagne tower. The planner presented the final invoice. A huge deposit was needed up front to secure the vendors. Sophie presented her platinum card with a casual flick. The planner ran it through the machine. Declined. Sophie laughed nervously, blaming some bank error. She tried a second card. Declined. Her smile went stiff. She dug into her Birkin bag for Mark's main corporate card. The planner ran it. The screen flashed. Confiscate card. The planner set the machine aside. She said the vendors needed payment by noon or the bookings were gone. Sophie stumbled into the hall, her hands shaking as she called Mark. It went right to voicemail. Within the hour, the planner emailed the caterer, the florist, and the band. The gala was off. In a town like Aspen Falls, that kind of news spreads through the grapevine before she even got to her car. Her social status was gone in the time it took to drink a coffee. The final bomb landed in a quiet suburban living room. Arthur and Eleanor sat in their armchairs, tea gone cold. The silence was thick, broken only by a ticking clock. Arthur's pride was wounded, but he believed Mark was a titan who had just suffered a temporary setback. He was sure Mark would bounce back and keep bankrolling their lifestyle. Then the landline rang. It was Sophie. Her voice was shrill, almost hysterical, as she explained the frozen accounts and the cancelled party. Arthur tried to sound in charge. He told her to calm down, promising he'd transfer money from his and Eleanor's home equity line to cover everything. He hung up, went to his study, and logged into his online bank account. He navigated to their property details, expecting to see decades of equity. He froze. Staring at the screen, the numbers were impossible. A massive negative balance was listed against their home. A second mortgage had drained every penny they owned. Arthur clicked on the loan documents, his hands beginning to tremble. The date was a Tuesday night 8 months ago. Arthur remembered it clearly. Mark had shown up with a briefcase and a bottle of fancy wine. He'd spread out a thick stack of papers saying he was setting up a special family trust for them. Mark said this trust would handle their club membership, Eleanor's car lease, and their property taxes automatically. He complimented their financial savvy, poured more wine, and just pointed where to sign, rushing them to lock in the rate. They signed everything without a lawyer, completely trusting their golden son-in-law. The truth stared back at him from the computer screen. Mark hadn't been funding their lifestyle with his money. He'd secretly used their house as collateral for his failing business. The car lease, the club fees, the fancy dinners they'd paid for it, all themselves, with money Mark borrowed against their own home. He'd given them scraps of their own money to keep them happy, and on Sophie's side. Eleanor walked in and saw her husband, S. Gray, sunken face. Arthur turned the screen to her. The truth hit them like a physical blow. They had traded a loyal daughter for a fraud who stole their home. The leash they thought connected them to luxury was actually a noose, and Mark had just dropped the rope. They were left with nothing. Their savings were gone, their social standing erased. Their home was headed for foreclosure. Arthur picked up his phone, staring at the blank screen, barely breathing. He knew there was only one person left in the state who had the power to save them from total ruin. He opened his contacts, found my name, and got ready to make the call that would unleash a whole new storm. The Tuesday morning light over the mountains was crisp and clear, making long, peaceful shadows on our new hardwood floors. Liam and I were in the bedroom packing for our 2-week honeymoon at a secluded resort in Belize. I was folding a sundress, feeling genuinely light for the first time. The wedding was done, the secrets were out. And for the first time in 29 years, I felt free from the crushing weight of my Family S expectations. Then my phone started buzzing on the nightstand. A sharp, angry vibration that wouldn't quit. It sounded like a dam breaking. I put the dress down and walked over to it. The screen was a chaotic waterfall of notifications, scrolling faster than I could read. Missed calls, voicemails, urgent texts flooded the screen. The senders were all my family. Arthur, Eleanor, Sophie. I unlocked the phone and went to my voicemail. 5 messages from my father, all in the last 30 minutes. I hit play on the first one, putting it on speaker. "Chloe?" My father's voice trembled, stripped of all its usual condescending authority. He sounded frail, desperate, and so much older than I remembered. "Chloe, pick up the phone, please. We are in serious trouble." Mark lied. He took out a second mortgage on our house. The bank just sent the default notice. They're going to take it all. I stood there perfectly still as his words washed over me. He stopped, taking a shaky breath. "I know Liam's company holds the debt. I know he runs the place. You have to talk to him, Chloe. You have to ask him for mercy. We're going to lose the house. We have nowhere to go. Call me back." The message ended. Then I saw a text from my mother. "Chloe Vance, why didn't you tell us? We're so proud, honey, but we need your help now. Mark's project is failing and he's taking us with him. Your father has chest pains from the stress. Tell Liam to stop the foreclosure. We're family. Family helps family." I read the text again and then a third time. There was no apology for leaving me at the altar, no remorse for ditching my final dress fitting, no acknowledgement of the pain they caused by choosing Chloe S. fake party over my wedding vows. Instead, there was just the sheer nerve of their demand. They were drowning in the mess of their own shallow choices, and they expected me to rescue them. They assumed the daughter they always treated as an afterthought would instantly call up her tech mogul husband to bail them out. They still thought they held some power over me. They believed my love was a bottomless well they could draw from whenever Marcus' fake money ran out. My sister's text message revealed everything. Chloe wrote, "Clara, Marcus is having a panic attack in the bathroom. The investors pulled out of the project. You have to fix this with Julian. We are family. Don't you dare do this to me." She wasn't asking for help. She was blaming me for her husband's downfall. She was furious that her story had changed, that she was no longer the perfect daughter sitting on a mountain of borrowed money. And she actually expected me to put her right back on the pedestal she had just fallen from. Julian walked into the bedroom holding 2 passports and a travel folio. He stopped at the doorway, taking in the scene. He saw my rigid posture, the phone's glow, and the cold, unreadable look on my face. He set the passports on the dresser and then came over to me. He didn't ask what was wrong, he already knew. The legal team at his company, Nexus Dynamics, had executed the margin calls at 9 that morning. The consequences were hitting their targets right on schedule. "They're panicking," Julian stated quietly, his voice both analytical and incredibly gentle. "Yes," I replied, my voice steady. "Marcus took a second mortgage out on their house to fund his commercial property. They just found out. They're asking you for mercy." Julian looked at me, his dark eyes steady and grounding. He was giving me the floor. He was giving me the power to decide the fate of the family who had shattered my heart. "How do you want to handle this?" Julian asked. "I can stop the proceedings. I can restructure their debt. It's your call, Clara. Whatever you need for your own peace of mind, I'll make it happen." I looked down at my phone. My parents were facing foreclosure. My sister was facing public humiliation and total financial ruin. My father, the man who refused to walk me down the aisle to protect Chloe's feelings, was begging for a rescue from the man he mocked for being too casual. I thought about the empty chairs at my school award ceremonies. I thought about the cancelled dress fitting. I thought of the moment I stood alone at the top of the aisle, ready to face a crowd without a father by my side. I looked up at Julian. The guilt I felt for outgrowing my toxic family vanished, replaced by a profound and icy calm. "Let them sink," I said. Julian nodded once, accepting my verdict without any hesitation. He didn't judge me. He understood that mercy is for people who show remorse, and my family had shown none. I pressed the power button on the side of my phone. The screen prompted me to slide to power off. I swiped my finger across the glass. The screen went black. The constant stream of desperate messages stopped instantly. I dropped the dead device into my carry-on bag and zipped it shut. We drove to the Denver International Airport in comfortable silence. We boarded our flight, leaving the bitter Colorado cold behind. As the plane lifted off the runway, banking east toward Bali, I looked out at the shrinking landscape below. Back in Denver, the Davies family was trapped in a nightmare they built themselves. My father was dialing a number that would never connect. My mother was crying over a house she no longer owned. Chloe was sitting in a small, leased apartment, staring at a husband who had built their life on a foundation of pure lies and debt. They were frantically searching for the emergency exit, completely oblivious to the fact that I had already walked through it and locked the heavy door behind me. The financial safety net had snapped, but it hadn't freed them. It had just whipped back and struck them all down. While they scrambled in the ruins of their fantasy, Julian and I were heading toward the jungle, ready to enjoy the peace of a victory we earned. But this story was not over. Running from a problem is not the same as concluding it. A locked door only works if you are willing to face the people banging on the other side when you finally return home. And I knew with absolute certainty that they would be waiting for me in the lobby of my own empire. The air in Bali was heavy, fragrant, and a world away from the sharp, high-altitude chill of Colorado. We were staying at a private resort tucked into the dense rainforest, where the only sounds were the rush of the ocean and the calls of tropical birds. There were no cell towers, there was no Wi-Fi in the villas. The isolation was absolute, and for the first 3 days it was terrifying. For 29 years, my nervous system had been wired for a state of constant, low-level anxiety. I was raised to anticipate the next crisis, the next shift in mood that would decide whether my family found me acceptable or a burden. My survival strategy had always been to surrender. I made myself small, quiet, and useful, believing that if I simply required less space, they might eventually offer me a permanent place in their lives. Sitting on the teak balcony of our villa, watching the Pacific's horizon swallow the setting sun, I felt the ghost of my phone vibrating, the one I had powered down and shoved to the bottom of my suitcase. The silence was profound, yet my mind was deafening. The guilt of outgrowing my abusers was a heavy, suffocating blanket. I kept picturing my father, the man who had taught me to ride a bike on a dusty Denver road, opening a foreclosure notice. I pictured my mother packing her things into cardboard boxes. I was safe, surrounded by luxury and the man I loved. But the conditioned reflex to fix their problems pulled at me like a strong undertow. Julian walked out onto the balcony carrying 2 glasses of fresh mango juice. He wore linen trousers and a plain white shirt, his shoulders relaxed. The corporate titan who had dismantled my brother-in-law's empire just days ago was gone, replaced entirely by the grounded, calm man I had fallen in love with. He set the glasses on the small table and sat beside me. He didn't ask what I was thinking. He didn't try to distract me with forced cheerfulness. He simply existed in the quiet space with me, offering a steady, unshakable presence. "You're waiting for the other shoe to drop," Julian observed softly, his dark eyes tracking a colourful bird flying past. "I'm waiting for the guilt to stop," I admitted, my voice barely louder than the crashing waves below. "I keep thinking about the house, the one I grew up in. I know they brought this on themselves. I know Marcus is a complete fraud. But knowing that doesn't erase the fact that my parents are losing everything, and I have the power to stop it, and I am choosing not to." Julian turned to face me. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't tell me they deserved it. He offered something much more profound. "Peace is not the absence of conflict, Clara," he said, his voice a low, resonant anchor. "Peace is the presence of unshakable boundaries. You spent your entire life believing that love was transactional. You believed you had to earn your place by absorbing their toxic behavior. What you are feeling right now isn't guilt. It is grief. You're grieving the family you deserved but never actually had. I stared at the condensation forming on the glass of juice. He was right. The ache in my chest wasn't born from a desire to rescue them. It was born from the realization that even if I did rescue them, it wouldn't change a thing. If I wired them the money, if I saved their house, they wouldn't suddenly respect me. They wouldn't apologize for abandoning me at the altar. They would simply view my resources as their new financial leash, replacing Marcus S. empty promises with my hard-earned capital. The dynamic wouldn't heal, it would just reset. They will expect you to fix it when we get back, Julian continued, his gaze unwavering. They will try to use the history you share to bypass the boundaries you just established. You have to decide right here on this balcony who you are going to be when that happens. Are you going to be the daughter who seeks their approval, or are you going to be the woman who built an empire? The question hung in the humid air, heavy and definitive. I looked down at my hands. They were the hands of an architect, calloused, strong, and capable of coaxing life out of the harshest soil. I had built a $5 million company from nothing. I had secured the loyalty of a tech billionaire through sheer competence. I had walked down an aisle and pledged my life to a man who saw all of me. I had spent my life tending to the roots of my own existence while my family worshipped cut flowers. I had survived the drought. I didn't need to apologize for finally thriving. I'm the woman who built an empire, I said. The words tasted foreign at first, but as they left my lips, they solidified into a hard, undeniable truth. Julian smiled. It was a slow, brilliant smile that reached his eyes. Yes, you are. The shift was internal, but it was absolute. For the next 10 days, the phantom phone vibrations stopped. The urge to power it on and check messages just vanished. I swam in the warm ocean, hiked rainforest trails, and spent hours talking with Elias about the future we'd build in Montana. I stopped torturing myself over my parents' self-made disaster. I accepted I couldn't save people determined to drown in their own fantasy. Their choices were their own, and so were the consequences. I was no longer the underdog begging for scraps from their table. I had built my own, and I controlled the guest list. On the last morning of our honeymoon, I packed the linen dress into my suitcase. I took my phone from the bottom of the bag. The cold device sat in my palm. I knew the moment I turned it on, the screen would flood with notifications, desperate pleas, angry demands, and panicked updates about Preston's collapsing empire. I didn't turn it on. I slipped it into my carry-on, leaving its screen dark. I would deal with it all when we landed in Bozeman, on my own terms and in my own time, and then we were on the jet back to the bitter Montana cold. I sat by the window, watching the green jungle shrink below. I was returning to the mountains completely changed. The soft girl who wanted her father's approval had died 3 days before my wedding. The woman flying home was armoured, detached, and fully aware of her own strength. But as the plane turned north toward Bozeman for the final leg of our flight, a cold reality settled in. Ignoring the drama was easy with an ocean between us. The real test of my new boundaries was waiting for me on the ground. My family was desperate, cornered and completely stripped of their pride. And cornered animals don't respect a locked gate without first trying to break it down. I knew they wouldn't just wait for an invitation. They were going to force a confrontation on the very ground I had fought so hard to claim. The air inside my new botanical facility was perfectly climate-controlled, smelling of distilled lavender and damp earth. It was a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 2 weeks since my wedding, and I was in the glass-walled production lab, reviewing the first big shipment for Caldwell Hospitality. The expansion was incredibly fast, funded by that $5 million contract, turning my small greenhouse into a modern commercial lab just outside of Bozeman. Elias sat at a conference table just outside the lab, finalizing the deed transfer for our new house. Maya Thorne, who flew back that morning to oversee the bank acquisition's final stages, sat across from him. The entire atmosphere was productive and calm. That calm was shattered the second the heavy glass lobby doors burst open. I looked up from my tablet as the sound of shouting echoed down the corridor. My receptionist, a sharp young woman named Chloe, was backing away from her desk, her hands raised as if to calm them. Pushing right past her, ignoring all my security rules, was the Ramirez family. Hector was leading the charge, his face red, wearing a suit that now looked a size too big for him. Vivian followed, her face a mask of panic and outrage. Isabella trailed them, clutching her designer coat tightly while dragging a hollow-eyed Preston by the arm. They looked utterly desperate. They looked like people who had spent the last 2 weeks bleeding out their money and reputation and had finally come to corner the only surgeon who could save them. I didn't run and hide. I didn't call for security. I put my tablet on the counter, smoothed my white lab coat, and walked calmly out into the lobby. Elias and Maya stood up in perfect sync, moving to flank me with a quiet, lethal precision. "Penny!" Hector shouted, his voice cracking as he saw me. "Tell this girl to step aside. We are your family. We don't need an appointment." "Actually, Hector, you do," I said. My voice was perfectly steady, carrying clearly across the lobby. "You bypassed security? You're trespassing?" "Trespassing?" Vivian gasped, clutching her pearls in a practiced, dramatic gesture. "We are your parents. We are in a crisis, Penelope. We've tried to reach you for weeks. Why is your phone off?" Preston talked away from Isabella's grasp. He looked physically sick. The smug developer who had mocked Elias's boots was gone. In his place was a man on the verge of financial ruin. He scrambled forward, ignoring me completely, and fixed his terrified eyes on Elias. "Elias, please," Preston begged, his voice shaking. "You have to stop the foreclosure, the commercial site, the mortgage. It's all connected. If you call in that mezzanine debt, I lose everything. I am your brother-in-law. You can't do this." Elias just looked at Preston with the cold, analytical stare of a CEO assessing a bad investment. He didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. "I'm not your brother-in-law, Preston," Elias said quietly. "I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Thorn Enterprises. You broke your vows. You lied to my face. The affair is over because I caught you, Julian, not because you're sorry. It was a business decision." That's how he tried to frame it. He looked at me, his eyes pleading, but they were empty. "How can you say it meant nothing? We are having a baby. A family sticks together. Chloe, please, think about the baby. We can get through this. We just have to be strong." He reached for me. "Strong?" I thought, my voice low and steady. "Don't you dare use our child against me." The nerve was breathtaking. He stood there, a fallen king in the mess he had created. He pointed a shaky finger at me. "Penelope, that's enough of this. You're acting like a spoiled brat holding a grudge. You will tell your husband to stop this nonsense. You owe us respect. We raised you. We provided for you. You will not let our house be taken from us because you're having a tantrum over a wedding." He said it with such conviction, truly believing the emotional power he'd held over me for 29 years was still there. He actually thought he could just command me into submission. I looked at the 4 of them standing in the lobby of the empire that I built. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. The anger I carried for years had finally crystallized into absolute, unshakable clarity. I turned to Maya. "The portfolio, please." Maya reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick black portfolio. She handed it to me with a sharp, approving nod. I unzipped the portfolio. It was filled with printed copies of the digital folder I had kept so carefully. I pulled out a single sheet of paper and walked toward Hector. I didn't hand it to him gently. I pressed it flat against his chest, forcing him to take it. "That is a certified transcript of the voicemail you left me 3 days before my wedding," I said, my voice echoing in the now silent lobby. "The one where you said, 'I'm not walking you down the aisle. Your sister says it would upset her.' You abandoned me at the altar to spare her ego, Hector. That was not a wedding detail. That was a choice." Hector stared down at the paper, his mouth opening and closing with no sound. I reached into the portfolio again and pulled out a printed email. I walked over to Vivian, who was shrinking away, and held it up for her to see. "This is the email chain between the venue manager and me," I continued, my eyes locked on my mother's terrified face, detailing how Preston tried to bribe her with $5,000 cash to cancel my wedding venue 2 days before the ceremony. He tried to buy the ground out from under my feet so Isabella could host a fake anniversary party. And you, Vivian, skipped my final dress fitting to help her pick out centerpieces for that same party. Vivian let out a small, strangled sob, covering her mouth with her hand. I turned to Isabella. I pulled out a high-resolution screenshot of an Instagram story. I held it out so she could see her own smug face looking back. "This is the picture you posted the night of my rehearsal dinner," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal tone. "The dinner my whole family skipped. You were at a steakhouse toasting Preston's investors with expensive champagne. You captioned it, 'Family is whoever supports your dreams.'" Isabella stared at the photo, her fake tears instantly drying up as she realized I had proof. I stepped back, standing shoulder to shoulder with Elias and Maya. I looked at the broken, desperate people who shared my blood. "You came here demanding respect." "Hector," I said, speaking directly to my father, "but respect is a currency. You spent all of yours on Preston. You let him buy your loyalty, and you let him steal your equity. You handed him the deed to your house because he leased a nice car and bought you rounds of golf. You traded your own daughter for a fraud." I looked at Preston, who was sweating and staring at the floor. "Ilias isn't a dirt-poor wilderness guide, Preston," I stated, delivering the final, crushing blow. "He owns the company that built your portfolio. He runs the fund that holds your bad debt, and the bank that is now foreclosing on you. My husband's legal team finalized the acquisition of that bank this morning. Your failure is entirely your own. We didn't destroy you, we just stopped funding your fantasy." The silence in the gallery was absolute. The Ashworth family had built their entire world on a foundation of status, and I had just pulled out the cornerstone. They were standing in the wreckage, completely exposed. My father looked at me, a desperate, pathetic pleading in his eyes. "Chloe, please, what are we meant to do?" I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing. The daughter who would have rushed to save him was gone forever. "You are going to leave my building," I said calmly, "and you are going to solve this yourselves." I turned to my husband, Liam. "Call security, have them escorted out. If they return, press charges for trespassing." I did not wait to watch them leave. I turned my back on them, walking back toward the presentation stage with Liam. The heavy glass doors slid shut behind us, locking the chaos out. But the fallout from that confrontation was just beginning, and the social order of Sterling Hills was about to shift permanently, leaving my family with nowhere to run. Liam raised a hand, a subtle, commanding gesture that summoned the gallery's security team. 2 men in dark suits stepped forward from the corridor, their expressions stoic and unyielding. They didn't need to speak. Their presence was a physical manifestation of the boundary I had just drawn. My father looked at the security guards, then back at me. The indignation that had fueled his initial charge into the gallery evaporated, leaving only a hollow, pathetic disbelief. He had spent his entire life assuming that family ties gave him an unlimited pass for bad behavior. He was discovering in real time that those ties had been completely severed. My mother reached for his arm, her manicured fingers trembling. "Let's go, Richard," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The performance was over. There was no audience left to manipulate, no leverage left to pull. My sister, Sophie, did not look at me. She kept her eyes fixed firmly on the polished marble floor. Her shoulders slumped beneath the weight of her designer coat. Her husband, Marcus, stumbled as they turned toward the exit, a man completely unmoored. Liam stepped closer, his presence a steady, grounding force. He adjusted the lapels of his jacket, already returning his focus to our investors. The confrontation was over, but the fallout was just beginning. In a town like Sterling Hills, news travels faster than a wildfire. The social physics of the community shifted instantly, reacting to the gravity of my father's public collapse. The Monday morning after the incident, the fraud investigation into Marcus's fund hit the papers. It wasn't a quiet audit, it was a loud, messy scandal. The immediate consequence was a swift and brutal expulsion from the circles they had clawed their way into. The country club, a bastion of exclusivity that valued image above all else, did not wait for the dust to settle. They suspended my parents' membership, citing unpaid dues and a vague violation of community standards. The reality was much simpler. The Ashworths' perceived wealth was gone, and my parents were no longer considered valuable assets to the club's ecosystem. Sophie experienced a similar, devastating fall from grace. The luxury charity board where she was a member quietly requested her resignation. The women who had fawned over her gala plans suddenly stopped returning her calls. The superficial friendships she had cultivated, built entirely on shared status and mutual posturing, dissolved the moment her credit cards started declining. The final crushing reality hit when the bank seized Marcus's leased sports car and the expansive house they rented in a gated community. Sophie, the woman who had mocked my biotech startup and my modest lifestyle, was forced to pack her designer wardrobe into cardboard boxes. She and Marcus moved into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the edge of town. She was experiencing the exact financial anxiety she had always assumed was beneath her, and she had to navigate it without the safety net of her parents, who were drowning in their own crisis. My father and mother were fighting a losing battle against the second mortgage Marcus had secured on their home. The bank was relentless, the foreclosure notices piling up on their kitchen counter like a ticking clock. The financial leash they had happily worn was now dragging them toward ruin. 3 weeks after the scene at the gallery, an envelope arrived at my lab, marked personal and confidential. I sat at my desk, looking at the familiar handwriting. It was my father's. The script was shaky, lacking the confident strokes he usually employed. I opened the envelope, pulling out 3 pages of stationery. The letter was a desperate, rambling plea for salvation. Richard wrote about the years he spent providing for the family, attempting to weaponize nostalgia to bridge the chasm he had created. He detailed the impending loss of the house, the shame of being dropped by the country club, and the physical toll the stress was taking on my mother. He claimed Marcus had deceived them, portraying them as innocent victims of a complex financial scheme. He did not apologize for his betrayal. He did not mention the years of sabotage or the coordinated campaign to erase me. The entire letter was a carefully constructed narrative designed to extract a bailout. He was asking for a loan, a significant sum of money to satisfy the bank and save their home. He promised to repay it, a hollow vow from a man who had already surrendered his integrity. I read the 3 pages slowly. I did not feel a surge of vindictive joy, nor did I feel the familiar, suffocating guilt that used to govern my decisions. I felt a profound, chilling indifference. I put the letter on my desk. I didn't draft a reply detailing their hypocrisy. I didn't need to explain my reasons. The time for communication was over. I opened a drawer, retrieved some heavy cardstock, uncapped a dark pen, and smoothed the paper flat. I thought about the girl standing alone at the science fair. I thought of the bride whose father refused to walk her down the aisle. I thought of the constant, exhausting effort to shrink myself to fit their conditional love. I pressed the pen to the paper. I wrote no salutation. I did not sign my name. I wrote a single definitive sentence. I hope you find the peace you refused to give me. I folded the card and slipped it into a fresh envelope. I addressed it to my parents' house, a house they would not own for much longer. I did not include a check. I did not offer a lifeline. I walked out to the reception area and handed the envelope to my assistant, asking her to ensure it went out with the afternoon mail. I watched the courier collect the outgoing stack, feeling the final heavy lock slide into place. The emotional wall was impenetrable. I had officially severed the last remaining thread connecting me to the Ashworth family. But as I turned back toward the lab, ready to focus on a new project for a major client, my phone vibrated. It was a message from Liam. He had been reviewing the final audit of Marcus's collapsed fund, and he had discovered an anomaly, a hidden account buried deep in the corporate structure, containing a substantial sum of money that Marcus had diverted before the bankruptcy filing spet. The message was brief, but the implication was explosive. Marcus was not just a terrible businessman. He was attempting to commit federal fraud, and my parents were listed as the primary guarantors on the account he used to hide the funds. The financial collapse was about to become a criminal investigation, and the Ashworth family was sitting directly in the blast radius. The following Thursday brought a biting, unseasonable frost to Sterling Hills, a stark reflection of the reality settling over my parents' house. The bank had finalized foreclosure proceedings, placing a heavy, inescapable deadline on their occupancy. Richard Ashworth, a man who measured his self-worth by the square footage of his home and the prestige of his club, was now navigating the humiliating mechanics of sheer survival. The refrigerator was nearly empty. My mother had spent the morning crying over silver serving platters she was trying to polish before pawning them. The leased car was long gone, repossessed in the middle of the night. My father needed to buy groceries, but his primary checking account was frozen due to the defaults tied to Marcus's fraudulent fund. He sat at his heavy desk, sorting through mail for any overlooked cash or gift cards. In the bottom drawer, wedged under final utility notices, his fingers brushed a crisp white envelope. He pulled it out. It was postmarked 2 months ago and bore my name. He tore open the envelope, his fingers shaking just a bit. Inside was the check I'd written him at the office, the one I wrote after he threatened to pull his small investment in our wedding venue if I didn't disinvite Liam's brother. The check was for $500. Robert just stared at it. For a man who once covered $1,000 dinners with my ex-partner's money, $500 was a joke. But now it was a week's worth of food, gas to visit another lender, and a brief pause from the gut-wrenching stress of having no money. He didn't think twice about the ethics of cashing a check from the daughter he'd betrayed. He ignored the memo line that simply said, "Venue deposit refund." All his pride had been worn away by sheer desperation. He grabbed his keys, walked to his old station wagon, the only car they actually owned, and drove to the nearest credit union. The branch was nearly empty. Robert waited in line, gripping the check, his gaze nervously sweeping the room. He could feel imaginary eyes on him, people he assumed knew all about his financial ruin. When a teller's window opened, he walked to the counter and slid the check over the cool granite. "I need to cash this, please," Robert said, trying to fake his old, confident voice. The teller, a young man with a polite smile, picked it up. He glanced at the account name, then began typing the numbers into his computer. Robert stared at the monitor, holding his breath, already planning how much he could put toward groceries. The teller stopped. He frowned, then typed something else. He picked up the check, looking at the date written on it, then back at his screen. "Mr. Miller, I'm sorry," the teller said, his voice dropping with obvious pity. "I'm afraid I can't process this for you." A cold dread shot through Robert's chest. "Why? Is the account empty?" "I know my daughter runs a very profitable company. The money is there." "Oh, the funds are available, sir," the teller confirmed quietly. "But the account holder issued a stop payment order on this check." "A stop payment?" Robert echoed, his voice unsteady. "When was that?" The teller looked at the system log. The order was placed at 9:15 in the morning on August 10th. August 10th. The date slammed into Robert. That was the morning of my wedding. It was the exact moment I was reading a text from my mother, saying they'd sit in the back and leave right after the ceremony to support my sister. I hadn't forgotten about the check. I had cancelled it with cold, calculated intent, making sure that financial link was broken for good before I walked down that aisle. Robert just stood at the counter, the stark reality of his choices crashing down on him. He had chosen Marcus's false promises over my loyalty, and now he was holding nothing but a useless piece of paper. He took the voided check from the teller, his hands trembling, and walked out into the biting Seattle rain with nothing at all. While Robert was dealing with the reality of an empty wallet, Marcus was facing a much more public kind of failure. The bankruptcy proceedings had stripped him of every asset, his position in the tech world, and any shred of dignity he had left. To pay off even a tiny piece of his enormous debts, and to avoid a deeper federal investigation into the shell accounts I had uncovered, the court ordered Marcus to find immediate, stable employment. The judge mandated that a huge chunk of his income would be garnished directly by his creditors. The biggest problem Marcus had was his own reputation. The tech startup scene in Seattle is a small, interconnected world. Everyone knew about his epic collapse and his shady business dealings. No respectable firm would touch a man who'd practically bankrupted his own co-founder's family. He applied for senior developer jobs, consulting gigs, and team lead positions. He got nothing but rejections. With the court's deadline closing in, Marcus had no choice but to take a low-level job through a temp agency. He just needed a paycheck, no matter how humiliating the work. On a cold, drizzly Tuesday, Marcus showed up at a huge logistics warehouse on the industrial outskirts of Tacoma. He wasn't wearing an expensive designer hoodie. He was wearing a bright yellow safety vest, worn-out work boots, and a company-issued baseball cap. They had hired him as a package scanner, a mind-numbing, minimum-wage job that involved standing for 8 hours, scanning barcodes, and making sure boxes were routed correctly. Marcus clocked in, trying not to make eye contact with the other workers, some of whom surely recognized him from his days of driving a new Rivian. He grabbed his scanner and walked onto the freezing warehouse floor, his pride completely crushed by the kind of basic labor he used to look down on. After a couple of hours sorting pallets, his soft hands already raw inside thin work gloves, he saw a line of polished black sedans pull up to the main office. Marcus recognized the cars right away. They were just like the ones that had pulled up to the waterfront hotel on my wedding day. The lead car parked by the executive entrance. The driver's side door swung open and Liam stepped out. He was wearing a perfectly tailored navy coat, looking exactly like the architectural powerhouse he was. Several of his partners followed him, carrying rolled-up blueprints. Marcus froze, dropping his scanner onto the concrete floor. He hadn't bothered to look up the parent company that owned the warehouse. He had just taken the job out of pure desperation. This massive distribution center, the newest and largest in the entire state, was a keystone project for Summit architecture. Liam, the man Marcus had written off as a glorified draftsman, wasn't just the husband of the woman he'd betrayed. Liam was the lead architect on the project, the one whose firm was paying Marcus's tiny paycheck. Liam was, for all intents and purposes, his boss. Liam strode toward the main office, discussing the loading bay schematics with the site foreman. He wasn't looking for Marcus. He hadn't set this up to rub it in his face. He just moved across the grounds with an easy confidence, checking on the progress of his firm's design. As Liam passed the sorting station, his eyes briefly scanned the area. He saw Marcus standing there in the yellow vest, looking small and defeated. Liam didn't even break his stride. He didn't smirk, and he didn't say a single condescending word. He just gave Marcus a quick, impersonal nod, the kind a boss gives a random worker, and kept walking toward the office. That total indifference was so much worse than any insult. Marcus stood there on the cold concrete, watching the man he had mocked command the very world he had lost. The karma of it all was brutal, direct, and perfectly balanced. The Miller family and Marcus were stuck in the disaster they had created, while Liam and I were just getting started. But dealing with the fallout of a toxic family means more than just watching them fail. The last step is learning to live in the peaceful void they leave behind, and building boundaries strong enough to make sure they can never hurt you again. 6 months passed, and the constant grey drizzle of the Pacific Northwest winter finally gave way to the undeniable warmth and colour of late spring. I was standing in the middle of a beautiful 10-acre property we'd found on Bainbridge Island. The land sloped gently down to the water's edge, offering a perfect, clear view of the Seattle skyline across the Sound. It was the new home Liam and I had bought together, a quiet refuge we built on our own terms, far from the drama and social climbing of the city. The earth under my feet was soft and smelled of pine and salt. Rows and rows of newly planted apple trees stood before me, their delicate white blossoms just starting to unfurl in the afternoon sun. The air smelled sweet, clean, and incredibly peaceful. I walked between the rows, gently touching the young, sturdy branches. These weren't decorative shrubs, fragile and helpless. They were rooted deep in the ground, built to withstand the coastal storms and flourish in the long summer days. In a way, they were a lot like me now. I got to the edge of the orchard where a simple stone wall divided our property from the wild coastal forest. I leaned against the cool stones, looking back at the city, and felt a deep, steady calm settle inside me. That constant buzz of my phone was finally gone. The learned anxiety, the endless waiting for the next family emergency to strike, had simply vanished. In the half year since I sent that final, one-sentence goodbye note to my parents, the silence from the Miller family had been absolute. I still heard things through the city's relentless gossip mill, but the news felt distant, like reading about strangers. The bank officially foreclosed on my parents' waterfront condo in February. Robert and Catherine had to move into a small rented townhouse north of the city, miles away from the exclusive social clubs they once fought so hard to belong to. Robert, having no other choice, took a major pay cut and a demotion, accepting a job as a junior project manager at a small construction firm just to have a steady income and benefits. Our marriage, built on designer parties and curated Instagram posts, shattered with that one video alert. The divorce was swift, brutal, and very public. Julian's perfect life was an illusion, and he was now scrambling to save his reputation and his precious tech company. A daily reminder of his spectacular downfall, I moved out of our glass penthouse into a quiet, simple apartment. I was surviving. I was breathing, eating, and focusing only on my baby, building a new life completely outside the perimeter of his universe. I used to think setting a boundary meant building a massive, impenetrable wall, a defensive maneuver to lock myself inside a fortress so I couldn't be hurt again. I was wrong. Standing in my new apartment, I realized a boundary is not a wall at all. It is a gate. And for the first time in my 28 years, I was the one holding the key. I could open the gate to people who brought light, warmth, and genuine respect into my life. And I could keep it locked against anyone who only sought to drain my energy to feed their own insecurity. Julian was locked out. He would never see our baby take his first steps here. He would never sit at the kitchen table my brother and I built. He would never know the peace of this sanctuary because he proved repeatedly he didn't respect the very ground it was built on. The sharp click of heels on hardwood broke my thoughts. I turned to see Catherine Albright, my lawyer, entering the conference room. She carried a thick leather portfolio, her tailored suit radiating quiet competence. Catherine looked completely at ease, a legal shark disguised as a calm, reassuring advisor. She sat across the polished table from me. She didn't open her file. She just looked at the documents I'd gathered, taking in the scale of the financial deception I had uncovered inside Julian's company. "You have done exceptional work here, Chloe," Catherine said, her voice a low, approving rumble. "This evidence will secure a settlement exceeding all projections. The board is terrified." "It was good intel," I replied, smiling. "You just have to know what to plant and what to pull out by the roots." She met my gaze, understanding the dual meaning perfectly. She closed her file with a decisive snap, a gesture of mutual respect. "Keep building, Chloe," Catherine said. "I'll call on Monday with their offer." She walked out of the room, a silent guardian navigating the city's legal maze for me. I turned back toward my new beginning. Leo was waiting in the lobby, 2 steaming cups of tea in his hands. He wore his old band t-shirt and jeans, looking exactly like the brother who always had my back, completely unimpressed by the corporate towers around us. He reached me, handing me a cup. The tea was warm and soothing, exactly what I needed. He didn't ask how it went. He wrapped an arm around my shoulders, offering that steady, grounding presence that anchored me through the storm. I leaned my head on his shoulder, closing my eyes, feeling the morning sun warm my face. I wasn't the discarded wife anymore. I wasn't the girl waiting for a man who was never coming home. I was a force in my own right, building a new life on my own terms. Beside a brother who saw my value long before Julian's world ever did. They say time heals all wounds. It's a nice sentiment you find on greeting cards from well-meaning strangers who've never known the deep betrayal of a cheating partner. But sometimes healing doesn't come from time passing. It comes from realizing you don't need the person who cut you. You don't need their approval, their apologies, or their presence. You just need to stop setting yourself on fire to keep their illusions warm. If you're listening right now and you're in a relationship that constantly makes you feel small, if you've spent your life shrinking yourself so someone else could feel big, I want you to know something. You're not required to tolerate betrayal just because it's wrapped in the guise of love. You have the right to stand up, walk out and build your own empire. It'll be terrifying at first. The silence will feel deafening, but I promise you, the peace you find on the other side is worth every single tear it took to get there. Have you ever had to close the gate on a toxic relationship? Did you finally stop waiting for an apology that never came? Drop your story in the comments below. I read every single one because your story matters. You're not alone and your peace is worth protecting. Take care and keep building. We often plant expectations for our partners in the soil of our own unmet needs. We water them with our desires, prune them to fit our image, and without realizing it, starve the very roots we're meant to nurture. The story of Chloe and Julian isn't just about a dramatic affair and a messy divorce. It is a mirror held up to the modern power couple, reflecting the quiet, insidious ways we fail the person we love. When a marriage becomes a ledger of status symbols, love becomes a cold transaction. We forget our responsibility is not to mold a trophy spouse, but to build a resilient partnership. In the pursuit of a pristine public illusion, people can fall into the trap of the trophy spouse mentality. We saw this with Julian. He put Chloe on a pedestal built entirely on superficial metrics. He funded her lifestyle and prioritized her image over her actual well-being. But curating a perfect life to the point of delusion is not strength. It's a profound weakness. By shielding himself from genuine connection and inflating his ego with money and affairs, Julian became fragile, dependent, and fundamentally hollow. He navigated the world by buying his way out of problems, possessing no internal compass. Meanwhile, the emotionally neglected partner, Chloe, was pushed to the margins of the picture-perfect marriage. Every partner deserves an equal seat at the table. That seat should never be contingent on how well they perform for society's approval. Honesty and fairness must be the bedrock of the home. We are conditioned to believe violence only leaves bruises, but emotional neglect leaves scars that outlast any physical mark. Julian committed a relentless, quiet violence against her spirit. He treated his wife not as an individual, but as a tool to extract social prestige. He prioritized the cheap thrill of an affair over the fundamental happiness of his pregnant wife and unborn child. When a man calls his wife crazy for being hurt by his lies, he is teaching her that her character is worthless unless it serves his narrative. True partnership requires deep emotional awareness and listening instead of imposing your own narrative. When a partner fails to show empathy during the pivotal milestones of a shared life, they don't just miss a celebration. They sever a bond that may never be repaired, leaving behind a permanent psychological ache. If you've ever felt like an outsider in your own relationship, or had to build your own strength because the person who should have protected you walked away, you are not alone. Take a moment to subscribe and join our community. We share these stories because finding your own voice is the best kind of justice. The most profound lesson in this story lies in the vital distinction between cut flowers and deep roots. Modern culture often glorifies the cut flower. We celebrate the flashy car and the curated social media life. The affair was this fleeting beauty, a cut flower, relying entirely on the borrowed water of a broken marriage and the thrill of a secret. But a beautiful bouquet, no matter the price tag, is destined to wilt the second it loses support. Alara, on the other hand, she was the deep roots. She was cast into the shadows, forced to get by in the cold and left to face every storm alone. But in that darkness, she found her own independence. She learned real skills, built resilience, and forged a character of steel. So when the bitter winter of financial and social collapse finally came, the perfect bouquet was gone in an instant. The deep roots, they survived and they thrived. A parent's real job is to nurture those roots. As Julian Thorne said in his letters, a father is supposed to clear the path for his daughters. If he won't, he loses any right to stand in her garden. Parents should be protectors and guides, not the obstacles their children have to overcome or the people who exploit their success. As children become adults, the family dynamic itself has to evolve. Modern parenting means teaching your kids the absolute importance of healthy boundaries. We often confuse boundaries with acts of aggression or walls built out of anger. Alara learned that a boundary is not a wall built to trap you. It is a locked gate, and you are the one holding the key. Its respect is the currency of any adult relationship. It has to be earned through consistent, honourable behaviour, not demanded just because you share a family name. We have to encourage our children to build their own lives on a foundation of competence and ethics, not manipulation and lies. When we teach them to value their own peace, we give them the armour they need to survive in a world that will constantly try to take it from them. The silence that fills a home after a family shatters is heavy and complicated. Betraying a child's trust isn't just a small mistake, it is a fundamental fracture that changes the relationship forever. The Monroe family learned far too late that forgiveness can't just be summoned on demand. It must come with genuine remorse, a deep and honest look at the pain they caused, not just a panicked plea for help when the bank starts calling. Love has to be given freely for who the child is, long before the emotional walls become too high to climb over. As we navigate our own dining rooms and family gatherings, we have to ask ourselves what kind of garden we are actually planting. Are we nurturing roots that will survive the inevitable storms? Or are we just arranging cut flowers, hoping they last one more day? Look at the people sitting with you tonight. Consider the impact of your words and the legacy of your actions. Because eventually, the winter comes for every single one of us. And the only thing left standing will be what we actually took the time to grow.